Welcome to the deep dive. Today, presidential powers.
Oh, yeah,
Always a hot topic.
absolutely.
Right. You sent over some really sharp legal analysis about presidential powers,
Yeah.
especially in foreign affairs and wartime. And we're
Yeah.
excited to break it all down.
It's a bit of a legal maze, but we'll help you navigate it.
Right. We're mainly focusing on excerpts from this document you shared titled Pasted Text.
Right.
It lays out some key court cases and legal principles that'll help us understand the delicate balance of power between the president, Congress, and the courts, especially when things get tense internationally.
Yeah.
By the end of this deep dive,
Sure.
you'll have a much clearer picture of who gets to do what when the stakes are high.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how this balance shifts depending on whether we're talking about foreign policy or wartime scenarios.
Okay, so let's start with foreign affairs. Why does it always seem like the president has so much more freedom to act in foreign policy than on domestic issues? What's the legal reasoning behind that?
Well, it comes down to the idea of the president being the sole organ of the U.S. in foreign relations.
Right.
You've probably heard that term before.
Yeah.
But what does it really mean? It means that the president is the one voice, the single representative who speaks for the entire country on the world stage. When you're dealing with other countries, you need a unified front and the ability to act quickly. That's where the president comes in.
So it's like having one captain steering the ship of state through international waters.
Liz.
But what about Congress? Don't they get a say in foreign policy too?
They do, but their role is more complex.
Okay.
Sometimes it's about what Congress explicitly authorizes, but other times it's about what they don't explicitly oppose. There's a really interesting case, Dames and Moore v. Reagan from 1981, that illustrates this point perfectly.
Okay.
It happened in the aftermath of the Iran hostage crisis.
Ah, yes, the Iran hostage crisis.
Yeah.
I was pretty young then, but I remember it being a huge deal. What happened with the courts?
Well, after the hostages were released, President Carter had to figure out how to settle all these legal claims against Iran. He set up this arbitration process. And some people challenged whether he had the power to do that. The case ended up in front of the Supreme Court.
So was the Supreme Court saying Carter acted alone and it was all okay?
Not exactly. Here's where it gets interesting. Congress hadn't specifically said that Carter could do this, but they also hadn't blocked him.
Right.
And in this case, the Supreme Court basically said that congressional silence, combined with the urgency of the situation, meant they were giving tacit approval to the president's actions.
So sometimes doing nothing is a form of approval. That seems like a slippery slope, especially when you're dealing with something as important as foreign policy.
It definitely raises some questions about how much weight the court should give to congressional inaction. But the key takeaway from Dames and Moore is that presidential action can sometimes get tacit approval from Congress, especially in foreign policy, where speed and decisiveness are often crucial.
That makes sense. It's like in a crisis, sometimes you just have to trust the captain to make the tough calls. This pasted text document also mentions a case called U.S. v. Curtis Wright from 1936.
Right.
How did that add to this idea of the president having broad powers in foreign affairs?
U.S. v. Curtis Wright is considered a landmark case for presidential power in foreign affairs. It really solidified the idea that the president has these inherent powers in foreign affairs that go beyond what's explicitly written in the Constitution. It involved Congress authorizing the president to regulate arms sales during a conflict in South America. The challenge was whether Congress could even delegate that power to the president.
So it sounds like this case was less about a specific action by the president and more about the source of their power in foreign affairs.
Exactly. And the court's decision really emphasized the president's special role in dealing with other nations. They said that the president has this inherent authority derived not just from the Constitution, but also from the very nature of sovereignty and the nation's role in the world. It's a much broader view of presidential power than what you see in domestic affairs.
Okay, so foreign affairs are complicated, but what about treaties?
Yeah.
Those seem even trickier because they involve agreements with other countries. Does the president have the power to make and break treaties unilaterally? What happens when Congress disagrees with the president on a treaty?
That's where things get really interesting. This document you sent mentions a case called Goldwater v. Carter from 1979, which dealt with President Carter ending a defense treaty with Taiwan.
Okay.
The case ended up in front of the Supreme Court, but they basically sidestepped the whole question of whether the president can unilaterally terminate a treaty.
So the court punted.
Pretty much.
They didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Pretty much. Some of the justices argued it was a political question, not a legal one, meaning it was something for Congress and the president to work out between themselves, not for the courts to decide.
So sometimes the courts just say, hey, this is above our pay grade. You guys figure it out.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really give us a clear answer, does it? What happens when there's a genuine conflict between the president and Congress over a treaty?
That's the tricky part. There's not always a clear-cut legal answer. Often, these power struggles end up being resolved through political negotiations and compromise, rather than a definitive ruling from the courts.
Okay, so we've seen how the president has significant leeway in foreign affairs, but it's not a blank check. Congress and the courts still have important roles to play, even if the lines can get a bit blurry. But I have a feeling things get even more complicated when we start talking about the president's wartime powers.
You're absolutely right. Fasten your seatbelts, because this is where things get really interesting. When we talk about wartime powers, it's like we're watching this constitutional tug of war between Congress and the president.
Right.
The Constitution lays out the ground rules, but in reality,
Yeah.
it gets messy.
So it's not as simple as Congress declares war and the president fights it. What does the Constitution actually say about who gets to do what when it comes to war?
Well, on the one hand, the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war.
Right.
Seems straightforward, right? They also get to fund and regulate the military, which gives them a lot of control over how wars are fought. But on the other hand,
Right.
the president is the commander-in-chief, meaning they're the ones actually in charge of leading the military and making strategic decisions during a conflict.
I see. So you've got Congress holding the purse strings and officially saying, we're at war, but then the president is the one calling the shots on the battlefield. That sounds like a recipe for conflict. And I'm guessing that tension is where the war powers resolution comes in.
You got it. Things get even more complicated because modern warfare isn't always about formal declarations of war. You have these situations that escalate quickly or conflicts that don't fit the traditional mold. That's why Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973,
Okay.
largely in response to the Vietnam War.
Okay, the war powers resolution. I vaguely remember learning about this back in school, but honestly, it went in one ear and out the other. What's the gist of it? How does it actually try to limit the president's power to send troops into action?
The War Powers Resolution, or WPR, tries to put some constraints on the president's authority as commander-in-chief by requiring more congressional oversight.
Okay.
There are two main provisions,
Right.
the 48-hour notification rule and the 60-day withdrawal rule.
Those sound pretty specific. So
Yeah.
walk me through them. What do they actually mean in practice?
Basically, the WPR says that if the president deploys U.S. troops into hostilities, they have to notify Congress within 48 hours. It's like a heads up to Congress that things are happening. And then, unless Congress gives explicit authorization for those troops to stay longer,
Right.
the president has to withdraw them within 60 days.
Interesting. So it's like a built-in time limit, forcing the president to either get congressional approval for military action or bring the troops home. That seems like a pretty significant check on presidential power, especially for those presidents who like to go it alone.
Yeah.
But has it actually been effective? Has the WPR really limited presidents from sending troops into action without Congress's say-so?
That's the big question. It's been a source of controversy ever since it was passed.
Right.
Some argue that it's unconstitutional, that it ties the president's hands too much, especially in emergencies. Others say it's absolutely essential for checks and balances, preventing presidents from getting us into wars without Congress's consent. In reality, it's been applied unevenly. Some presidents have found ways to work around it, and Congress hasn't always been assertive in enforcing it.
Right.
It's kind of this legal gray area.
Yeah,
And to really understand how it works, we need to look at some actual court cases.
that makes sense. It's one thing to have a law in the books, but it's another thing to see how it's actually interpreted and applied in real-life situations. So let's dive into some of those landmark cases. This pasted text document you sent highlights a bunch of them, spanning from the Civil War all the way to the War on Terror.
Right.
It's amazing to see how these cases from different eras still shape how we think about presidential power today.
They really do. Each case offers a different lens through which to view this balance between security and liberty, especially during times of conflict.
Okay, so first up, Ex parte Milligan from 1866. This one goes all the way back to the Civil War.
Right.
What was the issue there?
Ex parte Milligan is fascinating because it deals with the limits of military power even during a war.
Right.
It involved a civilian named Lambden Milligan who was sentenced to death by a military court.
Wait, a civilian tried by a military court? That doesn't seem right. Don't civilians have the right to be tried in regular courts even during wartime?
That was exactly Milligan's argument, and the Supreme Court agreed with him. They ruled that it was unconstitutional to try Milligan in a military court because civilian courts were still functioning in the area where he was arrested. It was a strong statement about the importance of maintaining civilian legal processes even during a time of national crisis.
So Ex parte Milligan was basically saying, even in a war, the regular legal system should operate as much as possible. It's not just a free-for-all where the military gets to call all the shots.
Exactly. It set an important precedent for limiting martial law and preventing the military from overstepping its bounds. It essentially said that unless civilian courts have completely broken down, civilians can't be subjected to military justice.
That makes sense. But I can also see how things could get murky in situations involving actual enemies or spies during wartime. Are those cases treated differently?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the next case. Ex parte Quirin from 1942. This one happened during World War II and involved German saboteurs who were caught sneaking into the U.S. They were tried by a military tribunal and sentenced to death.
So different outcome than the Milligan case. What was the distinction?
Yes, the outcomes were different, but the reasoning is crucial. In Ex parte Quirin, the Supreme Court upheld the use of the military tribunal because they were dealing with enemy combatants who were accused of violating the laws of war. They drew a clear line between those types of offenses and ordinary crimes.
So the court was saying that the type of offense matters. It's not just about whether it's wartime or not, but also the nature of what the person is accused of doing.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between security needs and individual rights. And as you can imagine, this balancing act gets even more complex in the modern era, especially after 9/11 and the War on Terror.
You're right. That's what I was just thinking. The war on terror must have really pushed the boundaries of these legal questions about presidential power and wartime detention.
Oh, absolutely.
What were some of the key cases that came out of that period?
There were several important ones that grappled with the limits of presidential power in the fight against terrorism.
Okay.
3 cases stand out.
Okay.
Hamdi Rumsfeld, Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, and Boumediene v. Bush. Each one dealt with different aspects of detention, military tribunals, and the rights of detainees, and they all contributed to this ongoing conversation about how to balance security and liberty in a post-9/11 world.
Okay. Let's break those down one by one. First up, Hamdi v. Rumsfeld. What were the main issues in that case?
Hamdi v. Rumsfeld was a landmark case decided in 2004 that dealt with the detention of Yasser Hamdi,
Okay.
a U.S. citizen who was captured in Afghanistan and labeled an enemy combatant.
So another case of a U.S. citizen facing military justice rather than being tried in a regular court. What was the Bush administration's argument for holding him without trial?
The Bush administration argued that they had the authority to detain Hamdi indefinitely without trial, based solely on his designation as an enemy combatant. They claimed that in the context of the War on Terror, the president needed this kind of flexibility to protect national security.
Right.
However, the Supreme Court pushed back, saying that even in times of war, the president's power is not unlimited.
So what did the court actually decide? Did they side with Hamdi or with the Bush administration?
It was kind of a split decision.
Okay.
The court agreed that the government could detain Hamdi as an enemy combatant, acknowledging the need to prevent individuals who pose a threat to national security from rejoining the battlefield. But they also said that even enemy combatants who are U.S. citizens have due process rights.
Right.
This means that Hamdi had the right to challenge his detention and present his case before a neutral decision maker.
So it was a compromise, recognizing both the government's need to protect the country and the individual's right to challenge their detention, kind of a balancing act between security and liberty.
Exactly. And this theme of balancing is central to all of these war on terror cases.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to the next case, Hamdan v. Rumsfeld. What were the key issues there?
This case, decided in 2006, involved military commissions that President Bush had set up to try detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Salim Ahmed Hamdan, who was Osama bin Laden's driver, was one of those detainees.
Ah, Guantanamo. That's been a source of controversy for years. So this case was about whether those military commissions were even legal in the first place.
Exactly. The main question was whether the president had the authority to create these military commissions without congressional approval.
Right.
The court also looked at whether these commissions violated international law or the Uniform Code of Military Justice,
Yeah.
which governs the U.S. military.
So what did the court say? Did they give the green light to these military commissions, or did they side with Hamdan?
The court ruled against the Bush administration. They said that the president couldn't just ignore the limits set by Congress, even in the context of fighting terrorism. The military commissions were struck down because Congress hadn't properly authorized them, and they didn't meet the requirements of existing military law.
Okay, so another win for checks and balances. The court was basically saying that the president can't just act unilaterally even in a war on terror. They still have to operate within the legal framework set by Congress.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Let's move on to the last case in this group. Boumediene v. Bush. That one rings a bell. What was the main issue there?
Boumediene v. Bush, decided in 2008, was another huge case for detainee rights. It focused on the detainees held at Guantanamo Bay and whether they had any constitutional rights, specifically the right to habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus. That's the right to challenge your detention in court, right?
Yeah.
To say, hey, I'm being held illegally and I want a judge to review my case.
Exactly. It's a fundamental right in our legal system.
Right.
But the Bush administration argued that the Guantanamo detainees who were not U.S. citizens and were being held outside U.S. territory didn't have this right. They claimed that habeas corpus didn't extend to Guantanamo.
I see. So it was a question of whether those fundamental rights applied to these detainees in this very unique situation. What did the court decide? Did they buy the Bush administration's argument?
In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled against the Bush administration, saying that the detainees did have the right to habeas corpus. They emphasized that even in wartime, the president's powers don't simply erase fundamental rights. They also said that Congress can't just suspend habeas corpus without a clear constitutional basis.
Wow, so the court was basically saying, even in the fight against terrorism, even for non-citizens held outside U.S. soil, those fundamental rights still apply. That seemed like a pretty strong statement about the limits of executive power.
It was a landmark decision affirming that the Constitution and the rights it protects cannot be easily set aside, even in the face of national security concerns. These war on terror cases really highlight that ongoing tension between protecting the nation and upholding individual liberties.
It's fascinating and a bit overwhelming to see how much these cases from different historical periods have shaped our understanding of presidential power. It's clear that there's no easy formula, no simple answer to the question of how much power the president should have, especially during times of war or national crisis. It's a constant balancing act.
You said it. And the courts have a critical role to play in that balancing act, ensuring that even in the most challenging circumstances, individual rights aren't simply swept aside.
Okay, that was a lot to process.
Yeah.
It seems like the courts are constantly being asked to step in and draw the line between letting the president act quickly, but also making sure they don't have too much power. I'm curious, is there any one case that you think really exemplifies this struggle?
Well, I think Hamdi v. Rumsfeld is a great example. It really captures the essence of this debate. On the one hand, you have the government arguing that they need to be able to detain individuals who pose a threat, even if those individuals are U.S. citizens. On the other hand, you have the individual's right to due process, to challenge their detention, and to have their case heard. The court's decision in that case really tries to strike a balance between those competing interests.
That makes sense. It seems like the captain of a ship during a storm analogy that we were talking about earlier really applies here.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. The president, as the captain, needs to be able to act quickly and decisively to navigate through a crisis, whether it's a war or a major foreign policy challenge. But they're not sailing alone.
Right.
They have a crew, which in this case represents Congress and the courts. And the crew is there to make sure the captain doesn't overstep their authority, to make sure the ship stays on course and doesn't veer off into dangerous waters.
I love that analogy. It really captures the dynamic tension between these different branches of government. The president needs flexibility to act, but they also need to operate within the bounds set by Congress and the courts.
Exactly. And just like on a ship, you need that balance of power. The captain can't just do whatever they want, and the crew can't micromanage every decision. It's about working together to ensure the safety and success of the entire ship, which in this case is the nation.
Well, I think we've steered this conversation into some pretty deep waters, exploring all these legal complexities around presidential power. Let's take a moment to come up for air and reflect on what we've learned. All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into presidential powers. We've seen how those powers expand and contract depending on the situation, whether it's a foreign policy crisis or a wartime scenario. It's clear that there's a constant push and pull between different branches of government, with the courts often acting as the referee. But let's bring it back to our listener. What are some of the key takeaways they should walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that presidential power, especially when it comes to foreign affairs and national security, is a complex and evolving area of law. There are no easy answers, and the lines are often blurry. But here are a few key points to remember.
Okay, I'm all ears.
First, the president has significant leeway in foreign affairs, often acting as the sole organ of the nation on the world stage.
Right.
That doesn't mean they have a blank check, but it does mean they have more flexibility and authority than in domestic matters.
Right.
Second, Congress and the courts still have crucial roles to play, even in foreign policy.
Yeah.
Congressional authorization or even just a lack of strong opposition can be a powerful force in shaping presidential actions.
Right.
And the courts can step in to clarify the boundaries of presidential power, as we saw in cases like Dames and Moore v. Reagan.
Okay.
Third, wartime powers present a whole different set of challenges.
Right.
The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, but the president, as commander-in-chief, has a lot of authority to direct military operations.
Hmm.
The War Powers Resolution tries to create some balance,
Right.
but it's been a source of ongoing debate and controversy.
Right.
And finally, the courts have consistently sought to uphold a balance between security and liberty, even in times of war. Cases like Ex parte Milligan, Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, and Boumediene v. Bush demonstrate that even in the face of serious threats, individual rights cannot be simply disregarded.
That's a fantastic summary. It's amazing to see how these court cases from different eras and different contexts continue to shape our understanding of presidential power today. It's like they're part of this ongoing conversation about how to govern ourselves in a world that's constantly throwing new challenges at us.
I couldn't agree more. It's an ongoing conversation, and it's one that we all need to be a part of.
You know, thinking about all these cases, it really reinforces that captain of a ship analogy.
Yeah, absolutely.
The president might be at the helm, but they need the crew, Congress, the courts, and ultimately the American people to help navigate through those stormy seas.
Absolutely. It's about finding that delicate balance between giving the president the authority they need to act decisively, but also ensuring that their power is exercised responsibly and within the framework of the law. It's a dynamic tension that's at the heart of our constitutional system.
So here's a question for you and for our listener. In a world where threats are evolving so rapidly, from terrorism to cyber warfare to climate change, how do we strike that balance? How do we ensure national security without sacrificing the very freedoms that define us as a nation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are no easy answers, and the line between security and liberty can be incredibly difficult to draw.
Right.
It requires vigilance, thoughtful debate, and a willingness to grapple with complex legal and ethical questions. It's a conversation that we as a society need to keep having.
Well said. This deep dive has provided some historical context and legal frameworks for thinking about presidential power. But the real work happens when we take those insights and apply them to the challenges of today. So to our listener, what do you think? Where do you stand on this issue of balancing security and liberty in the 21st century? This deep dive has given you the knowledge. Now it's up to you to decide what it means and how it shapes your own views.
I think that's a perfect way to end this deep dive. It's about empowering each individual to think critically about these issues and to engage in those important conversations about the kind of future we want to create.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.